looks like you've almost finished with your app, and you notice the requirement for use context is kind of tucked in there at the bottom. So we need to switch over from having our user and set user state to a user context. And the benefit of that is, a place like navbar on line 57, where you're passing the set user setter down, you're not going to have to pass props anymore for anything that's held in use context, because that it becomes a global state, which means it's available directly in any component as long as you write a few lines of code. So I think the documentation that they provided in phase 2 is useful. So you get the phase 2 kind of page up. I don't think there's one single page for this, but basically, if you're watching this video, just go to your phase 2, and then you can do a find on context. It's kind of the easiest way to get to this particular lesson. Yeah, it's called React Context, and it's in this very long section.
Yeah, state events.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll come back to this in a second. Let's get some of the files set up over here. I personally prefer the separate file program. So a lot of times you'll just create a separate folder under SRC, which is your context folder. This would be especially helpful if you were going to have multiple context files. Say yours is about trails, right? So you could have a trails context and a user context. So we're only going to do user. So you can call this whatever you want. In the documentation, they just call it lowercase u user.js. If you want to follow a more like component oriented one, you could call it the user context file. It's up to you.
Yeah, I've seen folks doing it. Do you do this capitalized in this case, or keep it?
Right. Yeah, I would just follow the sort of regular component concept. So then at that point, I think let's go about a quarter way down the documentation here on the left and pull up this import React from React const user context. Yeah, let's get this guy. Okay. And, so obviously that first line, we're just bringing in React so we can call the create context. You could also just import create context instead of importing React, but it doesn't really matter how you do that. And then there's really two things here, the user context and the user provider. And beyond establishing the fact that I have this thing called user context, I don't really do anything else with that, except down in line 11, you see it's saying user context.provider. So we're going to circle back to the user provider here in a second, but at this point, I think we can go to the app.js and we can import what we need here and remove some of the stuff that we're not going to use. So one of the things that we're going to use in the app.js is we're going to want to bring in the user provider that we exported. So that's just a separate file that we're bringing in, import. And most of the times when you start saying what you want to bring in, yeah, curly braces user provider, it'll finish typing it for you. If not, then you have to do the hard work of figuring out where it is relative to where you are. So just make sure you got the double. Yeah, that takes us down one, then contexts, and then user context is the name of the file. Okay. So what happens is we're going to take line 12 out of the app, and we're going to bring it up into the user context because we're going to hold our state in that context file. So we can cut that. And this goes in the user provider. So it goes between, say, 8 and 9. Okay. And then the next thing I would take out of app is the /me, your authorization kind of auto login. I think that use effect can be pulled out and put into your context file because that's really the location of the state. So that makes sense to say every time this needs to be refreshed, we'll start here, and then we'll try to fetch me to see if there is an authorized user. And then let's go back to app.js. So the only thing that's tricky here is that you got a ternary. So what I would normally do is say, okay, let's go down into the main return and let's wrap up everything else under that user provider.
Yeah.
Because we have a ternary, we need access to user here. So we're going to actually have to put the user provider one level up. So let's go ahead and cut that import user provider line from line 8. And let's go to the parent of app, which is
Just our index,
index.js. Okay.
which is hiding somewhere. There we go.
So let's bring in the import line there. And then I think, I'm not sure it really matters. You could put it inside the browser router and around app. We're just wrapping up our app one way or the other with our user provider.
And just like so.
Yep. And then app goes in the middle of those, however you want to do that. Okay. Okay, so at this point, if we go back to app.js, let's kind of take stock of where, so if is your server running right now, your client-side server?
It is running. Yep.
So you can, at this point, I think you can start to see relative imports outside of SRC are not supported. Okay, so it doesn't like this ... context because we're not in the components folder. I think we just have the address wrong now
Oh,
because
right. Because now that we're in index.
yeah, we don't have to drop down a level. We can just start from the root. Good. Okay, try that again.
And
Okay.
then take.
Yeah. And so now we're at app.js problems. Like all of them are, I don't know what user is. I don't know what set user is. Do notice that there's an easy one to fix in the user context where we've used 2 hooks that we haven't said we needed. So we need to go back and fix that real quick. And I think that then you would need to try doing this as use state, use effect, and create context and see if we can simplify line 5 to just create context instead of react.create context.
Oh, yeah. Just the hook, right?
Okay, great.
Nice.
Okay, so back to app.js. So now we're on sort of the second half of this, and there's still a little more to do in the provider, but we'll circle back to that in a second. So in app, you said it at a bunch of different places in your routes. You were going to pass down user and set user. You've also console logged user and have a conditional rendering for not user. So basically, for sure, we definitely need user. If we want to just see it kind of come back online, we can use context to bring in user and set user. Eventually, I would recommend going through every single component, and anywhere you pass a user or set user prop, you take it out and you go down to the child component and you say, where do I actually need this thing? And that's where you're going to bring it in. So let's look at how we bring in the context. Let's go back to the documentation or the lesson. Okay, scroll down a little bit. I think it's like halfway down the page.
Is this our bottom one down here?
No, that's the user provider.
Okay, gotcha.
So, all right. So here's an example let's look at the header component. So there's a couple things that you're going to need. You see in the first line, it says import react, comma, use context. So use context is a hook. So anywhere we use it, we're going to have to say we need it. So let's go into our line 1 on app.js and add the fact that we need use context. Then you can see that we're going to bring in the context file. And so that's another one. And we just have to make sure we get the address right.
And this is the thing we're going back to, right?
Yeah.
Slash.
All right. And then the line of code looks like the one that they've got underneath the header function header. This is where we actually bring in whatever variables we want, variables, functions, anything we've exported. So underneath the above or underneath, it doesn't matter. You could say something like const user equals use context, user context. Okay. Now, this is still going to be broken. So let's fix the provider. And then I think we'll be back to kind of good. And then you can do a lot of the rest of it yourself.
Okay.
If you scroll down to about 3/4 of the page, it shows you a more finished user provider function. Yeah. And you can see we have a bunch of stuff that's already the same. If you go back to your user context file, we've got the user provider with the children as the argument, and we've got the const user set user. So we're just going to highlight the return and swap that out with the return. The only thing that's really different is sort of the spacing and the formatting is different, but the value is different. So instead of exporting null, we're going to export at the very least user and set user. And we put those in double curlies because we want to export an object. Now that means that on the other side in app.js, when we receive the output of the user context function, we should deconstruct it. So it'll be const curly brace user instead of just const user. Yeah, and you
Can we
can
do both here? Yeah, just to pull them both in.
For now, eventually the set user is going to be, because they're always used as props. The value of this global state is you could go directly to the login component and you can bring in set user there
Gotcha.
instead of bringing it in here and passing it down as a prop.
Gotcha.
But at this point, if you put set user, I think we should not have any more errors because now it should know what user and set user are, and that's what was stopping it from compiling. So if you go back to we got one more user context is not defined, line 12. No, because it's use context as
There we go.
Right. Okay. And then console log user, and that should be coming from the user provider. Let's go back and just look at starting off as null. Okay. And which line is it pointing at? It's pointing at the console log. User's not defined.
Yeah, 29 here. Or actually further down.
Well, it's definitely saying app.js, but it's kind of pointing at a weird line.
Maybe it was it was saying 29, so a refresh seemed to clear it. But
yeah, like maybe that was before it registered that some of the stuff had been taken out.
Yeah.
Okay, so and if you right click and inspect, you should be able to see your user object as normal.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. So again, the value here is that now if you look through your components on this page and every other page, you should never have to pass user or set user down as a prop again. So we could do login as an example. If you take out set user equals set user, and we go to the login component, now you can take out set user as a prop, and you got to add three things. Number one, you got to go to line 1 and say, I want to use the use context hook. 2, yep, you're going to import user context because it's got to be able to access that file.
And this one, is this in curly braces?
I think so.
Yeah, It's what was exported from our user context.
Right.
And where are we? We're in login, so we need to go back a couple.
And then finally, you have to use the context on user context and then bring in const curly brace set user, because you don't need access to the user here. Yeah. So let's do a log out, and then we'll try to log in and see if it works. Awesome.
There we go.
Yeah. So it remains to be seen whether you think there's real value for this particular app. You know, I mean, if the props user and set user did not have to go very far down a hierarchy, then it's like, oh, you know, whatever. I got to add lines of code all over the place instead of having it stored in app and then passing it down as props. But the key payoff is, if in your capstone, if you want to use context instead of Redux, then you can hold more stuff in global state and really, you know, avoid prop drilling and sending things down. So when you start to get more complex component hierarchies, I think then you get the payoff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was curious too, that this totally makes sense, right? For our one user context, we've gone into our index, we've wrapped our app with, say, our user provider. How would it differ if, say, we also wanted to do that with like our trails and made context there? Would it just, could we like nest that second?
Yeah, but you could put
context?
the trails provider down in app, because there's nothing. Again, the reason we put your context, your provider, in the index was because you have this user line on line 22. So if I tried to put the provider inside of main, which is a lot of times where people end up putting their user provider, then it wouldn't know what user was on line 22, and then you'd have a problem.
Right.
But
Right.
since
Gotcha.
the trails are not referenced anywhere but below then
app.
you put your trail provider somewhere else.
Gotcha.
And I would point out that if you look at the login form, this actually is an example of where the prop drilling, like we put this here, but we shouldn't have, because actually set user is not used in this component, right? So we could have saved ourselves the trouble and just put it into the login form directly and into this sign up form directly.
Gotcha. Yep, because it's the only ones actually using those props there.
Right. So as you're evaluating where you need it, kind of get all the way to the bottom of the chain before you stick it in and say, okay, where do I need the user? Where do I need set user?
Because that's the whole point. We're not trying to pass props through every single child, just the ones that need it.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Cool. Any other questions?
No, I think that was it. I'm gonna end up working on the trails context here just a bit, but I appreciate you taking the time. That totally cleared that up for me.
Yeah. Awesome, Cody. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Thanks. Take care.
Bye.